r/AskReddit. Serious survivors of plane crashes, boat sinks or something catastrophic of this magnitude. What's your story? I'm late, but I hope some people can hear me out. I was in a plane crash when I was 9. It was a small plane, with only my dad and I being the only ones in the plane. The plane had 4 doors and a propeller. That kind of plane. We were about 1,000 feet over the San Francisco Bay, and the engine quit. The plane proceeded to fall, as would be the case. We approached the water, my 9-year-old brain coming to grips with the concept of death and such. We hit the water, and the plane skipped a few times, and water began to flood through the floor. My dad and I got out, and sat on the wing of our sinking plane for about 30 minutes, and the plane was too sunk to stay sitting on, so we had no choice other than to swim towards shore. The shoreline was miles away at least, however we had no other options. As we were swimming, mind you the water was freezing in October, another recreational pilot in a helicopter flew overhead and attempted to drop us life jackets. One was horribly off the mark, but we were able to grab one. After swimming for half a mile in t-shirts and shorts, we came across a mud flat and dragged ourselves onto it. We were waiting there for a while, and a Department of Fish and Game boat trolled by, looking for illegal hunters. This led to our rescue. When I got home, I took the best shower of my life. Now, I'm 19 and still have a residual fear of flying, but I'm okay with flying on my own and all that. I was in a smallish fishing boat charter that sank a little less than 12 miles from a Caribbean island in the Atlantic. From the first sign of trouble to looking straight down at the boat slowly sinking beneath the surface was only about 10 minutes time. Trust me when I say that's an image I'll never forget. A white sport fisher being swallowed by the dark blue beneath me. When boats sink, they sink. Somewhere in the chaos the captain called his friends in the marina before the boat sank, so we waited there just drifting for a while, collecting any floating debris we could hang on to. Fortunately we had life vests, otherwise I have no doubt we'd all be dead. 2 hours pass. Nobody comes by to pick us up. Clouds and rain are more frequent, so we lose sight of the island occasionally, and I finally convince everyone to agree to start swimming towards the island. I know the best thing to do is stay together and not move, but the island didn't seem too far away. And it was obvious to me that nobody was going to find us at this point. Just as we start slowly moving, our helicopter comes and hovers somewhere between us and the island, presumably over the coordinates the captain gave his friends. I swim my ass off towards that thing, and in so doing, lose sight of the captain and first mate, so now it's just me and my sister, and then the helicopter leaves. That sucked. But, given the weather, there was almost zero chance of them spotting us, unless we were right under them. We decide our best chance at survival is to keep swimming towards the island. The whole time it's rainy, cloudy, rough seas. There was a small craft advisory. Wish we had been told that before leaving the marina, and much of the time, literally hours, we can't see the island at all and use the wind as a directional guide. That sensation of not being able to see anything but grey skies and waves with nothing to grasp onto was the toughest part. We did see another helicopter before nightfall, when the weather started clearing a bit, but it was way too far away from us. Nightfall is also when we can tell that we actually made progress and were getting closer to the island, but the darkness changes all that, as all we could look at were a handful of lights on the island and a bright spot that was probably a resort 7 or so miles to the north. Fast forward to maybe 2 or 3 AM, some 15 to 16 hours after the boat sank, and we actually get to the island. Of course it's mostly cliffs, the water is colder, being churned from the deep by the currents hitting the island, so we swim south until we can see water that isn't white. We get out of the water maybe an hour later, and can barely walk. There are some lights in the distance, but no way we were gonna get to them in our condition, so we just tried to stay warm under some trees out of the rain. No sleep, just shivering and trying to stay warm. Finally the sun comes up, and we are able to stop shivering. We can walk somewhat better now, so we start drinking from a nearby stream, assuming we'll get to help before we die from some parasite, and start hiking over the hills. I tossed my life vest into a tree just in case someone spots it. The hike takes us a few hours over 2 ridges and through some pretty thick brush. Fortunately there were a few more streams. We finally get to a makeshift farm of sorts and decide to eat some bananas from a small banana grove. That's when we spot a guy walking to work on the farm. He feeds us some crackers and water and walks up the road to call the police for us. Based on where we got to land, they changed their search and found the captain and first mate in the water shortly thereafter. We all end up in the hospital around the same time, and we finally got to escape the hospital after 36 hours and several bags of fourth fluids. There's a lot more that happened in that whole 72-hour period, but you get the idea. Funny thing, we went back about 8 months later and tried to get a boat to take us to where we got to land, but they all said it was too dangerous. It was all over the news for like 2.6 minutes, like everything these days. Even though we all survived, I still have PTSD from that event, which sucks. It's pretty well triggered when I'm on the water and it's stormy, or in airplanes and it's turbulent, and I fly all the time sigh, but PTSD be damned. I'm planning on buying a sailboat by the end of the year and sailing around the Caribbean and Central America, and if I can get enough blue water experience across the Pacific, we'll see. Back in 2008, I was in a hiking/sightseeing tour with a well-known rugged travel outfitter. The tour started in New Delhi, India and ended in Kathmandu, Nepal. Halfway through the tour, we meander our way to Varanasi when there were rumors of strikes in Nepal, mainly Lumbini and the Chitwan National Park area. So instead of taking a bus to the border to get to the park in Nepal, we took a plane. Crisis averted, right? Landed in Kathmandu, and of course the baggage handlers decided to strike. Had to wait about 5 hours to get our bags. We stayed about a day at Kathmandu, and about the strike ended, we ended up proceeding with our trip to the Chitwan National Park and staying at a homestay for a few days. After a few days of getting our fill of elephant riding, hippo watching and tiger tracking, there were rumors going around in the village about a huge strike next day with travel on the roads potentially barred with the threat of death. We all decided to head out extremely early so we would not be stuck in Chitwan for potentially days. So around 3 AM, me and 11 other members of the group and our guide and driver head out into the dark and onto Kathmandu. It was quiet for about the 15 to 20 minutes of driving in the dark. Lots of meandering turns around small villages and lakes. However, that was stopped short. We saw a small minibus torched, fires burning wildly, and soon we were stopped by these masked villagers holding sticks. One of them came to the driver's side and pulled the driver out, proceeded to repeatedly smack him on his face over and over. Another masked man tried to open our passenger door. Luckily it could only be opened by one side, and luckily it was held tightly closed by a burly Australian member of our group. While this was going on, another masked man broke our back window. This resulted in a few of us crying in fear. Me, my cousin and a few other guys were thinking of breaking out of the car and tackling these masked men with skirts. Long guys. We figured the combined arms of a few Americans, Aussies and a German can take them down right. No sooner than we thought of that plan, motorcycles started roaring in close by, carrying Molotov cocktails. Shit. Our guide and the driver started pleading with them, saying we are tourists, there are women in here, and that we will go back in peace. Just let us go. They eventually let us go, told us to turn around and don't come out until the strike is over. To this day, every time I hear glass break, I cringe and remember these events clearly. 3 in advance for bad English. Since I live in Chile, I'm used to earthquakes. Perhaps in some countries an earthquake of magnitude 6.0 in the Richter scale is something big, but here is kinda normal. But the one I will never forget is the 8.8 earthquake in the Richter scale that happened in Santiago of Chile. Let me explain a bit. I'm a native of the northern region of the country, where most of the earthquakes happen, so the constructions are especially resistant against earthquakes. Santiago is not like that, since they rarely got movement. So back to the story. I was going to a concert in Santiago and was staying in a friend's apartment for the week I was there. It was the 27th of February of 2010. 3:33 AM. We were chilling with my friend and some of his when suddenly all the light went down. We thought that maybe the building got a malfunction. Then, looking through the large windows, we saw all the city went dark. I don't know if you guys have been on an apartment building during a huge earthquake, but summer rising is like being on top of a wet noodle that moves one side to another constantly. The The first thing that got to my head is to stay away from the large windows and go under the table. I happened to be very cold-minded in this situation's BTW. While my friend and his were screaming like hell, I tried to keep them calm by telling them the usual, everything is going to be okay. Earthquakes are usually short, so we just needed to wait in safe. Jesus, I was wrong. The earthquake was 3 minutes long. The largest 3 fucking minutes of my life. When it finished I was relieved. I checked if everyone were okay and they were just scared as FCK. I asked my friend, named Ben BTW, that we need to get the hell out of there. Ben gave me the reason and pack up a BP with some supplies. When he was getting his BP, his friends just run of the place to get to their families. Told them to stop, that we need to stay cool and together, but the need to see their families was greater than. I totally understand that. Ben finished packing, and we started running to the emergency stairs. We were making our way, while using the cell phones to illuminate the hallway, when suddenly Ben stopped me from nowhere. I asked him what wrong, and he just replied me look, pointing the flash of the phone to the floor. I was just like the movies. The building was split in half. A yellow HH sheet when he falls on his knees while looking at the bottom of the building. His friends, in the rush to see their families, didn't saw that the building was split in half and fell down. We expected the worst. Ben started crying, and I was in shock. Just 30 minutes back I was hanging out with them, laughing, and now I just see their bodies there. An infinity of screams and cries created the atmosphere of that night. We make our way down through the holes in the building. While doing it, we try to help as many persons as we can. Some trapped by giant stones, some just dead. The one image that will stick to me forever was the one of a mother hugging his daughter. In order to protect her, we find both of them dead. We got to the place where Ben's friends fall, and thanks to IDK they were still alive, with many broken bones but alive. We took them one by one to the road and wait for help from police, military, medics or firemen, but lucky us, we were all alive. I watched and experienced two sides of humans that day, the ones that try everything to help other in any way possible, and on the other side, the ones that take advantage of the situation just to steal stuff from destroyed homes. So that my story is actually why longer, but didn't want it to make it tedious to read. Thanks for reading a piece of my story. Edit. Wow, didn't expect this to blow up, haha. Thanks everyone for your kind words. We are actually fine now. For anyone curious, here is a pic of the building the next day. Random fact. 3 years later another 8,3 earthquake hit my city. Lucky me huh. When I was 9, we were traveling from our cabin back to town with a rope and boat. This was right before Easter. About a 45-minute trip. The seas were rough and the boat had a built-in flaw that caused it to break in 2 pieces due to the pounding on the waves. I sat face towards the back, so I didn't see it break, just suddenly had water up to my waist. When I turned around the nose was floating a couple of meters away from the boat. My mom's husband at the time just said jump, and so we did, into the black 2D water of the North Sea, as far away from the boat as possible. This was by far the scariest moment. Her husband managed to launch 2 emergency rockets before the boat vanished below him. He was a very poor swimmer, and even though we tried to hold on to him, he got away from us due to large waves constantly covering us. After that it was about 10 minutes of trying to swim to shore, which was about 400 meters away, before realizing we were never going to make it. After that we basically dodged waves and made bad taste jokes. We saw people on the shore, cars stopped on the highway. The last thing I remember before blacking out is a boat approaching. Then I woke up in the hospital basically trashing around from the cramps of my body trying to warm up. Apparently I had a temp of 27 degrees when they brought me in. My mom was awake the whole time. She lost control of her limbs right after I blacked out and gripped a rope from my life vest with her teeth, so I wouldn't float away. Even though this is a scary story, there are some awesome element to it. An old fisherman in a house by the shore saw the whole thing. He was desperately trying to get a hold of rescue services, but noon was where they were supposed to be. His wife, having lost both her previous husband and also a son at sea, had some kind of a health issue while watching us swim around. So he had to take care of her and try to get us help. The most baddest part of the story is how we got rescued. One of my mom's husband's friends got a call about what was happening. got in his boat with his 8-month pregnant wife, and went full speed to our location. The boat he had was not designed for high seas. It was a summer type cabin cruiser, so he had to steer it towards the waves at all times. His wife then proceeded to pull 3 fully clothed people up to safety, including an unconscious me. If anyone has ever tried to pull someone out of the water, you know how difficult it is. We all survived. I was totally fine, aside from my balls swelling up to 3 times the normal size for a couple of days. Mom tore a bunch of stuff in her back. Husband swallowed about 4 liters of salt water and was sick for a week. TLDR, boat broke I2, cold water, amazing rescue. Fuck, I'm late to the party. I was pilot in command of a small Cessna, taking my dad out for his first sightseeing ride on an October evening. He'd taken the backseat in one of my training sessions before, but this time was the first time the 2 of us were alone together and at liberty to go as we pleased. After a while, I noticed that the engine had lost 300 RPM. I pushed the throttle to maximum, no change. Turned on the carb heat, if I remember correctly. Nope, still nothing. I began heading back to the airport, but as the power slowly diminished, I knew we wouldn't make it back by a long shot. Conclusion: I had to get that bad down somewhere. It was nighttime. Beneath me were patches of fields or forest, and I couldn't tell which was which in the evening darkness. I opted for the only well-lit place in the circumstances, the freeway. I made my emergency call, got a response, told my dad what I was about to do, and proceeded to fly the airplane. By the time I was on my so-called final approach, the engine was puttering along at a measly 1000 RPM despite a full open throttle. All I had to do was to follow a slight bend in the freeway to the left, just past a viaduct, and I'd have 3 open lanes of road on which to land, and probably surprise a few drivers along the way. Huge black bars suddenly showed up in my field of vision, followed by bright white flashes of light. The aircraft had just struck high voltage power lines. By the time I was done screaming, the aircraft had rolled down in a side ditch and slammed itself against a fence. Ambulances arrived within a minute, pulled my dad and I out, and raced us to the hospital. I awoke in a dimly lit hospital room, dimly lit because of the city-wide power failure I'd just caused, which I realized once all the other lights turned on late at night and the nurses cheered at getting power back. Somehow, I didn't break anything, though I had a sore and stiff body for a few weeks, and my back became prone to locking for the next several years. My father had a few broken bones, but was judged stable and set to recover. However, he suddenly and unexpectedly succumbed to his wounds a week later. I haven't piloted an aircraft since, and have no desire to. I can be a passenger in an airliner or a commercial small aircraft without a problem, but my days of flying are over. I was on a boat that sank on the Mekong River in Southeast Asia. It was a 2-day trip with an overpass stop as it is too dangerous to be on the river after dark. We stayed in a bar and got extremely drunk as there was a serious tropical storm that knocked the power out in this tiny village on the banks of the river. The following morning we set off on the final leg of the journey really early the next day. Everyone was feeling pretty terrible after drinking way too much, so we're trying to catch a few hours nap on the boat. Around an hour or 2 into the journey the boat rolled quite heavily to one side and some cups and glasses slid off the tables and fell onto the floor, startling most people awake. We picked the stuff up off the floor and went back to sleep. I'm not really sure how much later, but the same thing happened again, but even more violently. The boat rolled so heavily I slid from one side to the other and smashed into a table on the now lower side of the boat. At this point I noticed that water had started to come over the side and was getting deeper. Everyone was looking around at each other looking pretty terrified, not knowing what to do. The water level was now at probably waist height. I told my GF to get out of the boat and swim for the banks of the river. I had to help her climb out the high side of the boat and onto the roof as the lower side was now pretty much fully submerged. At this point I realized I was stuck between the table I had smashed into and a bench that had fallen on top of my leg, with the water now getting towards shoulder height and the boat sinking pretty rapidly. I took a final breath and went down with the boat. It's hard to say how long, but it probably sank in around a minute, 2 if you were being generous. Luckily, as the boat fully sank, the benches and tables started to float and move away from each other, and I got free without too much trouble. I opened my eyes and all I could see was brown dirty water with some sunlight in the distance. I swam towards it, being careful not to knock my head on anything and knock myself out, trying to swim horizontal until I was sure I was clear from the boat before I could try for the surface. I managed to pop up not too far away from the riverbank. I looked around and saw a few of the other passengers being swirled around in the rough current, trying to grab anything that was floating to save themselves, calling out for help. I'm a pretty terrible swimmer, so realized trying to help anyone else would probably just end in them dragging me down with them, so struggled and eventually made it to the bank. I made it, but didn't have the energy to pull myself out of the water. I half got onto some rocks and waited to catch my breath. Some other passengers that made it out of the water ran over to tell me my GF was safe further downstream. The guy driving the boat had jumped in and pulled her out because she was struggling. To give some background detail, this boat was being run by a young family that lived on board. As it customary in large parts of Asia, it is considered rude to wear your shoes inside someone's house. As a consequence, we had to remove our shoes when boarding the boat. We were now trying to traverse the rocky banks of the river with no shoes, trying to find other passengers. Getting back to the main story, the captain of the boat at this stage was screaming at the river, not knowing if his wife and 2 children made it off the boat before it sank. We came across them later on. His wife had somehow managed to make it off with her baby slung over her back and her young son. After a while, we had managed to flag down another passing boat. Initially they didn't stop, but I think they must have started to see random bits of floating debris from the boat and realized what had happened and came back for us. Further down the river we found more passengers that had been rescued by some local fishermen. We tried to account for everyone and quickly worked out that everyone was present apart from one girl. No one had seen her during the scramble to get off the boat. We boarded the boat that we managed to flag down and left for the next nearest large town where we would be able to get in contact with our country's embassies. There was zero phone signal around here and all our phones were either in the river or completely soaked, which was over 6 hours away. The local fishermen promised us they would search for the missing passenger. Having made it to the next town after a pretty fucking long day, by this point we were greeted by the local police who were in plain clothes as it was Songkran and everyone was celebrating by having a huge 3-day water fight. They took some details and told us to come to the station in a few days. We ended up having to sit around for days sorting out loads of stuff as our passports were lost and all the local places that could do anything were closed. Once we got enough documents to allow us to move on and fly to the capital, we had to go to our consulate to sort out new travel documents and assist in the matter about the missing passenger with her friends that had made it off the boat. She was from the same country. After a few days the consulate informed us a body had been found, and unfortunately it was the missing passenger, which was pretty devastating experience to take along with the additional stress everyone was currently going through. My plane landed in a field and flipped. Flying in a single-engine Cessna 210, my family was on the final leg of a 2-week camping trip. My dad, piloting, had started the descent down when at 3,000 feet, our engine started rattling uncontrollably. 10-year-old me remembers seeing the oil temperature gauge in the red, but not understanding the significance. As the rattling got worse, my dad shut the engine off and radioed Mayday to the tower. That's when I started to pray. We were only 5-ish miles from our final destination, but we had to make an emergency landing in a field. I remember staring out the window at the ground thinking about my cat and my mom leaning back from the co-pilot seat to tell my brother and I to pull our legs up for the crash position. My dad exchanged a few other words with the controller and then shut the rest of the plane down. We hit the ground a little fast at 80 knots. Normal is 65 to 70 kts. Our front gear struck an irrigation pipe running across the field, which caused it to shear off. Without a front gear, our nose hit the field and we went belly side up. When I came to, everything was eerily dark and I was hanging upside down. My dad basically ripped the doors off the back of the plane to get my brother and I out. My family was shaken up, but okay. The farmer appeared minutes later, absolutely astonished. Then, 5 news helicopters starting circling. Traffic was backed up 4 miles around the field as people strained to get a look. Then the paramedics arrived. My mom likes to joke they were a bit disappointed to find victims of a plane crash to be standing around chatting. The worst injury of the lot was my cut lip, which I cut with my own teeth in the jolt of the crash. And my parents got some bruising from seat belts a few days later. The farmer's wife gave my brother and I Cheez-Its and honey sticks, and I can't eat them to this day. And the first thing I did when I got back home was hug my cat, as a 10-year-old does. As far as my individual story goes, I got my pilot's license 3 years ago at the age of 18. I'm now in school to become an aerospace engineer, where I hope to one day design planes that save people like this one saved my life. It failed in the most elegant of ways, and my dad's quick thinking and training was able to see us to the ground alive. Thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe the channel.